Hey guys, so here's our second example of graphing sine and cosine with all kinds of transformations going on. So first thing I do again is I write down my general formula, which is y equals a cosine. We're going to have bx minus c plus d. And just a refresher, a is the amplitude. That shows how up and down it goes. And then b, that helps us get our period, which for sine and cosine is 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b. Then this c, that helps me get my phase shift, which is c divided by b equals c divided by b. And then we have our d right here, which is just the vertical shift. So those are all main points. And now we can start graphing. Well, first we have to figure out, obviously, what it did here. So we've got amplitude. Amplitude is going to be 2. I wouldn't write -2 because we don't really need it yet. We just need to know that it reflected over, we may as well write it reflection over x-axis. That's what that negative means. So that's going to change cosine because instead of starting at 1, 0, it's going to start -1, 0, or 0, -1, my bad. And then, alright, so now we're working with b. Let's work our period. It's going to equal 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b. Well, the absolute value of b just has a 1 in front of it, so it's just over 1, which equals 2 pi. So nothing changes with the period. We do have a phase shift, however, and the phase shift can be defined as c over b. So c is actually a negative, and the reason this is because the formula says bx minus c, so right now we have x minus negative pi over 2, because that's what c is, and that turns into x plus pi over 2. So the phase shift is kind of typically going to be the opposite sign of this. So phase shift here is negative pi over 2. Hope that makes sense right there. And then the vertical shift, I'll just write Vs is -1. That just means we move down by 1. So the first thing I like to do is I like to draw my highest point and my lowest point. So first thing, we know the typical cosine starts, well, it goes from 1 or -1 all the way up to 1. Then what we've done here is we multiplied that by 2 with our amplitude. So then we'd say, okay, we're going to go all the way down to -2, all the way up to 2. And that's correct, but then we also went down by 1. So then at the end, we have to subtract this by 1. So what's -2 minus 1? Well, that's -3. So now we're going to go from -3, and what's 2 minus 1? That's 1. So we're going to be all the way down at -3, all the way up at 1. Make sure you do it in that order. Make sure you do the amplitude times the starting point, which is -1 to 1, and then subtract from that answer the vertical shift. That's important because if we subtracted 1 first, we would be doing 2 times 0, and that would give us 0 all the way down to -2, which is not what we want. So be careful with that. Make sure to start with the amplitude and then do the vertical shift. So we're at -3 and then 1. And then next I would look at okay, well, we had a phase shift of negative pi over 2. So the start of our graph is going to be at pi over 2. And then we also have a period is still 2 pi, so that's helpful. That makes it a little easier on us. So we know I would draw in all of our stuff. So pi over 2, pi, because you know you want to draw in whatever 2 pi, the period divided by 4. Those are going to be your important increments. And then all the way 2 pi, and then we subtract by negative pi, -3 pi over 2, all the way to -2 pi. Okay, so now let's pay attention to this reflection. That's the only thing we have not accounted for yet. We know we're going to start in this line right here, but because we normally would start at the top of the graph, right? But because it's a negative out here, it's reflected over the x-axis, which means we're going to be all the way down here. Remember, it's reflected and then well, it's reflected before it's subtracted 1 from the whole thing. So think about it, it's technically starting at 2, we're reflecting to -2 and then subtracting by 1. But you can just think about it, instead of starting at the top, we're starting at the bottom. That's the best way to do it. So that's what we're doing now. And then if you think about it, we can't go any lower than this. So we really only have one option, and that's to go up. And now first thing the thing I would like to do now before we really get into the graphing, so I would like to draw my midline. So if we're going from -3 all the way to 1, the middle of that is going to be -1. And that's going to be important for labeling all of our important points of this graph. Because that's essentially like the x-axis usually is for a normal cosine graph, but now since we moved it down, that midline is at -1. So at 0, we're going to be right back at the midline. Then we're going to go all the way up to our 1, which is our maximum value. Then we're going to start going back down. Then we're going to end up all the way back here. And then we're going to start going back up. And we can do that here. We can start it. Keep it going all the way to 1. Then back down to our midline. Now we can connect the dots, make it look wavy. Right here. And now I can check my work because I have what I think is the right graph. But now let's make sure that we've accounted for everything in here. Amplitude of 4. So if there's an amplitude of 4, I'm going to be 2 above the midline and 2 below the midline. That looks right. I went from -1 all the way up to 1. I went up 2. Then I went from -1 all the way down to -3. I went down 2. So check. Did I reflect over the x-axis? So pretty much I would say, well, I started my graph. Did I start by going up or down? Because if I reflected, I should start by going up. So yep, I reflected. Because cosine normally starts by going down. So period. Is the period 2 pi? Well, let's look at any part of the graph. We're looking for, we started -pi/2, went to 3 pi/2. That right there is 2 pi, and that looks like 1 period. Because, yeah, it's starting to go back up there. So that's that. We check that off. Is my phase shift -pi/2? So did I move over -pi/2 and start my graph there? Yes, I did. That's it checked off. Is my vertical shift -1? So did I move down 1? I was at 2, -2, and then I moved everything down 1 to get to 1, -3. So check. I did it. So thanks for watching again. I hope this was able to help you. These can be really tough sometimes, so just keep on practicing. Thanks.